biggest mistake people make is they'll hire skills over culture fit. Lead by example. That's first and foremost. Transparent, clear, set your boundaries.
That's Dipti Shah, global people leader, who sits on the board of trustees for both Mind and Dyslexia Sparks.
Morale was really low and engagement was also really low. Within a 3-year period, transformed it to becoming one of the best places to work for. Retention rates were 85, 86%. And all of those things, those engagement pieces, played a part in a successful private equity sale.
She's had vast experience in building great cultures for fast-growing companies.
Being scrappy doesn't always mean not having structure at all.
So many founders struggle with finding the right people and growing and managing their team. Are you one of them?
Individuals equally should take responsibility for their own development and staying ahead of the game.
If you're struggling to build and manage your team, keep listening. You've had so much experience with managing people and hiring lots of people too. What's one of the biggest mistakes people make when they're hiring for their first employees?
I think, particularly in startups and founder-led businesses, the biggest mistake people make is they'll hire skills over culture fit. When you're starting a company, there's a science to it, and that team that you recruit is your crew, essentially, and you need a good culture fit of people who are adaptable, flexible.
How can people work out that culture fit?
And through probing questions. You know your business, you know your personality and style, and you know what you're looking for, essentially. And, when you're at that startup founder stage, there's a lot of grafting to be done. So what you're testing for are skills of people that can be adaptable, can think slightly out the box, a little bit fun, to go off script.
And obviously communication is such a big part of that, right? Especially when somebody joins. Mm-hmm. How can people work on making sure they've got good communication with their team?
Lead by example. That's first and foremost. Transparent, clear, set your boundaries. That whole piece about relationship building is so key, that you understand the dynamic of how people work.
And how do you manage that? Like in terms of, say, for example, when you're at a corporate, they might have very strict timelines. Okay, you have a review at this time, you have a review at that time. In a startup, it can be a bit more chaotic. Mm-hmm. What systems do you think work well, or how can people think about what systems to use?
I think that comes down to having a transparent conversation, be it go for a coffee, do a regular check-in call, just see how you are. That question of how are you getting on? Do you need help? How can I help you? All of those things break down the barriers to build that communication relationship. Because when you're from a founder's perspective, you're building, you're grafting, you want to get to the end quicker. You've almost got what that next phase of growth looks like, trying to get there, and you're trying to get there as quickly as you can. But it's about adapting and understanding the people that you work with.
I think founders are terrible at hiring at the right time as well, because so many, they worry about, okay, it's better if I just do it myself. And when they then hire, they maybe hire later than they should, and then sometimes micromanage more than they should do as well. So if you're an early stage founder it's your baby, right? And you're hiring now somebody to help you out, how can you try to not be that micromanager, and how can you manage those relationships better?
Empower the people that you work with. So, the people that you're hiring, that person for a specific need, be it people, for example, to oversee some of the people aspects and from a strategic perspective, but also transaction perspective. So you need to empower that person to go and do what they need to do and deliver what they need to do without having to micromanage. And that person is going to be part of your team during that next phase.
And looking at that as well, so it's one of the emotional responses, right? Of, okay, I need to make sure it's being done my way. Mm-hmm. How much leverage can you give, or how much leeway do you give if somebody isn't doing it the right way and you don't want to micromanage them? Does that mean you let them go, or do you just willing to accept things in a different way?
As a leader, I think it's important to coach, and that comes from that open, transparent conversations, getting to know the person that you're working with, understand how they tick, how they work, and setting out those clear expectations and goals right from the very beginning, and addressing any sort of problems early on in doing that.
One of the biggest challenges as well with an early stage company is that there's going to be so many pivots, things are going to change completely. I was mentioning earlier about a couple of the companies I invested in. When I first invested in them, and 2 years later doing something completely different. And then that can make it really difficult for hiring too, because how do you hire somebody who can go with you on that journey and be there for the future as well, rather than just what you need right now?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, but I think it's quite key to the founder-led startup environment, because you're looking for that flexibility, you're looking for that adaptability, somebody who's going to grow with the business and adapt. And there's, the world is so turbulent. The world of AI is so turbulent at the moment. Everyone needs to have that growth, learning mindset. So again, it comes back to that cultural fit. Can you work with that person? Will they integrate with the team? Do they understand what you're trying to achieve? And be a grafter.
You mentioned there about AI as well. And now a lot of the news is saying about, okay, you can build $1 billion company with one person. And obviously it's not quite that easy. But how has this affected the way you're looking at things and the way that people you're working with are looking at things in terms of that hiring piece? Because do you see are people delaying the decisions to hire because they're thinking maybe I can use AI? Or I think a lot of people are just very confused right now about, do I hire? Do I use AI? What do I do? How do you think about those challenges?
Me personally, there's lots of mixed views out there. People think it's an opportunity to reduce the number of hires. Some people view it as to drive efficiency. From my perspective, AI is a great tool, particularly in the startup environment, to add value. And I think, whoever is hired and the founders should be thinking with that 10x mentality, that if they can increase value using AI, it releases them to do other things.
Have you got any examples where you see this working at the moment with companies you're working with?
In the recruitment area, particularly, in the HR arena, there's a lot of transactional, legislative, governance, admin. There are so many AI tools that can, quickly do predictives, and including on the reporting side as well. Rather than having 10,000 dashboards, AI is streamlining that and making it much more quicker to make decisions.
And obviously, even with the best intentions, right? Sometimes you hire people and things go wrong or there's a bit of conflict. What process do you go through with that in order to resolve the conflict as best you can?
I strongly believe in open, transparent conversations right from the beginning to address any niggles, to understand what exactly is going on. And that comes from relationship building, communications. And I think there's an acceptance in there as well that if things are not working out as should be, it's okay to have that conversation. And in some ways, it's called kind leadership.
And I know a lot of people worry about that too, right? Is that they hire somebody who they kind of think isn't right, but then they're very scared to let them go because it's that personal connection. And I think especially early stage founders, they almost, I've done this in the past, you try to be everybody's best friend, and then it makes it much harder to then let people go. What kind of steps can people put in first, or how do you know when it's the right time to let somebody go versus whether to coach them?
I think if those clear expectations are set right from the beginning, and you see this quite a lot in the founder arena, where a lot of the hires are done through networks of people. And so this conflict comes up quite often, where you're giving somebody a chance, you're giving them an opportunity, but then they take it for granted almost sometimes, and they don't deliver what they need to do. So that's where those clear expectations have to actually be set from the beginning, and those regular check-ins to do a simple, are we on track? Are we off track? And if we're off track, why are we off track? What are you doing to get yourself back on track? And so then it just eases the way to have a conversation. Okay, things are not working out. You might want to look elsewhere, or your skills are suited somewhere else. And I think, those entry and exit conversations on how you make people feel is the journey.
And looking at that too, so when somebody joins, when you're at a corporate, right, okay, I'm going to start as an associate, then I'm going to get senior associate after 2 years or 3 years, then it's manager, then whatever it is. You can join a company, say one of the big four or bank, this is my pathway, right? Because if you're a startup, you don't even know if the company's going to exist in 2 years' time.
No.
And that can be really scary for a lot of people. And I think especially when you look at the kind of people of Asian background as well, you have so many doing well in corporate careers who maybe could really thrive in the startup world, but it's just that fear of like, hey, if I move here, then what's going to happen? How can you attract people through maybe doing very well in the corporate space to come into the startup world and be able to give them some kind of reassurance or give them some kind of a pathway?
I don't even know if it's about pathways anymore in today's world, because even the large companies are seeing that the whole world of an arena of learning and development is changing, where, in time to come, you're not going to have job titles probably. A lot of it's about that skill and exposure to learning. So in my previous organisation, it was a global MarTech business and quite lean structured. But the exposure to learning horizontally was incredible. And it's about having that, I would encourage people to recognise potential. Obviously, do your due diligence, whether you see yourself as a fit, but approach it with a growth mindset in terms of the skills and development you may learn holistically.
Hello. Quick interruption to let you know a bit more about Bay HQ. We're the community for high growth Asian heritage entrepreneurs, operators, and investors in the UK. You can join us totally free at thebayhq.com/join. There you'll get our CEO structure in your inbox every week, which is content, events, and opportunities. You can also get access to our free Startup Fundamentals course by joining. Let's get back to the show. And I guess that was a big challenge right now. I look at it where, when I had used to have a job back in the day, is that you had different courses that company would pay for you to go on, things like that. Whereas now, because of AI and all the stuff that's available online, it's where does that responsibility lie? Because I think before, people would always look to the employer to be sending them learning material. Whereas now, is it the onus more on the employee to make sure that you're keeping ahead of the curve, to make sure you're adding value to the company? Or how should we think about that?
I think the employer always has a responsibility, and that is to provide an infrastructure, whatever it might look like, for learning and development and growth. But individuals equally should take responsibility for their own development and staying ahead of the game. And, with technology nowadays, there's no excuse really, because it's just available. Even if it's, you get these apps now that can compress a book into, flashcards. So there's no excuse really.
You mentioned earlier as well about leading by example. How can people be the kind of person that somebody wants to work for?
I think that's an internal question I would ask myself. Would I want to work for that company? If I was that company, what would I want it to look like? And what does leadership look like to me? And that's trust. That's leading by empathy. That's celebrating wins, giving recognition to the people. And I think I'd want to take people on that journey, and I would hope other founders felt the same.
And yeah, looking at that too, so you mentioned about celebrating wins there. And one of the big challenges of a startup, I know we do ourselves, right, is that so much changes all the time, and we don't necessarily put in enough time to really celebrate the wins because there's always new problems. There's no stability sometimes. So I think we look to the Q1 numbers and I need to still actually do them properly. But we know that we did pretty well in quarter 1 in terms of, I think it was more than half, we said 1,800 people attend our events in the first quarter, right? Which is more than half of the whole of 2024. But at the same time, as I see that number, and then I continue to my next problem. When you're in that environment which is so fast paced, how do you make the time to make sure that you are appreciating those wins and giving the team the recognition they deserve?
I think it's an important point to remember is it's to slow down, to speed up, and to look around you and gauge what's actually going on. Giving people recognition is such a simple thing, from a thank you, to saying well done, going out for dinner, sending a nice gesture. I think, when you're startup, it's scrappy, can be very scrappy. And more often than not, there's more problems than successes, and certainly in the beginning. And so therefore motivating the people around you, those people that are a key part of your team is really important. And, things that I personally love, that I've learned and seen from founders that I've worked with, is a smile, winning people with a smile. I worked with one founder in my previous place who would rock in about 11 o'clock, but the first thing he would do was walk around everybody's desk and say hello. And say, how are you? That was so motivating in itself and encouraging that the founders made that time to actually stop by your desk and to say hello. And it's simple things like that. Oh, well done. I saw that. Those giving recognition to those small achievements.
And obviously as well, so you're leading huge teams during very uncertain times in the past. And what things did you do to try and keep people motivated and to keep the spirits high, even when maybe you're seeing global economic shocks or you're seeing all these different things happening. And obviously people are going to be seeing the news, getting scared, but you obviously still want them to be feeling like they're supported and having them achieve at their best and perform at their best.
Whatever size business you are, the key thing that I've learned, and I've worked in multi-size, multi-sector businesses, is to listen. Listen to your people, and take on board their feedback to close that feedback loop, and try and address those. Obviously, some things may be easier to address than others. Some might not be so realistic, but the key point is to listen and to put in place demonstrable actions.
And you obviously worked in different size organizations too. What do you think has been the biggest difference between you looking at startups versus you looking at the large organizations? What things could people at the startup level learn from your experience at a much bigger level?
Being scrappy doesn't always mean not having structure at all, I think is the thing. People ultimately do look for some levels of structure, and in order to build and scale. And so when you set up that initial team, that team is your core of your flexibility and adaptability, and then you start building around it. And when you're building, you scale in mind. So therefore your structure processes come with it. And
I know now with the building out a career of the things you've done so far, what are some of the moments you've been proudest of in terms of where you've been able to manage people really well, and especially through hard times, that you want to just really appreciate?
One of the things that I am really proud of is, so my last business I joined just before COVID kicked in. It was a global business. Morale was really low and engagement was also really low. Within a 3-year period, transformed it to becoming one of the best places to work for in the UK and in some countries globally. Retention rates were at 85, 86%. And all of those things, those engagement pieces, played a part in a successful private equity sale.
And was he looking at the results of that, of people saying this is one of the best places to work? What were the key things they were saying that they really loved about that environment?
The listening piece was key. That was transformational actually, in terms of the initiatives that were put in place, communication, management of people. So that one of the things that I did was I took away hefty annual appraisals to make it more of a conversation, which was more real life and more appropriate to the environment, which was fast-paced.
And obviously looking forwards now, right? So you're working with different organizations, you're doing really interesting things. What are some things that you're most excited about in terms of how cultures are changing, or attitudes are changing?
It's a continuous learning journey and just continuously adapting from a personal growth perspective and the world of work. I think the generations and what different generations want is so varied, and just trying to provide an ecosystem that tailors to all. You've got some people that like to go into the office, some people like hybrid, some people don't want to do either. So, and just trying to create an environment that drives performance.
I guess that's one of the big debates of recent times too, is that you see some large organizations now telling people to go back to the office. Have you found that situation yourself when you've been trying to manage? Sometimes, like I said, some people want to be remote, some people want to be hybrid, some people in the office. How can you juggle that and try and work out as a founder, especially when it's in the early stages? So for example, we have our founder associate. We say she's got to come in most days because then she can sit with us and learn. And that's one of the things I think I struggle with, is if you're early stage or you haven't got much work experience, I feel like it's a lot harder to learn and not in person, being able to see all the little nuances. How have you managed that, especially when times where you couldn't work in person?
Try and do as many touch points as possible, remotely and through Teams. And I agree with you with your point. We've quite often always encouraged graduates, first-time job people to come in, and even whatever level you are actually, those first few weeks of in-person learning, really get to grips with the business, then understand the values, directions, and encourage as many collaborative opportunities as possible.
Yeah. So thanks so much for sharing your advice today. We'll move to quick fire questions. So first one is, who are 3 Asians in Britain you think are doing incredible work and you'd like to shout them out? So
I'm a big fan of Tej Lavani. Some of you might know him as from Dragon's Den. He's also the CEO of Vitabiotics, but in his early days, he'd won a Young Entrepreneurs Award. So I quite like following his journey, particularly on LinkedIn, and seeing what he's doing. And he's also been supporting his wife with her own little business in Beauty Effect, which is great as well. A second one, who has now passed, Bhavesh Patel. He was a personal friend, family friend of ours, who started from nothing to having a gift shop in Charing Cross, from which he grew a wedding event service called Mystic Events, which is now one of the chosen providers for many Asian weddings in the UK. He was very well known for DJing at parties in that day. So shout out to him, and his legacy continues with his team at the moment, which I also quite passionate about following and encourage everybody to follow, because it's what I like about his story actually is that even though now he's passed at a young age, his team are following through his legacy. So my third entrepreneur is a female Asian founder, Ruby McGregor Smith. It's a mouthful of a name. She was a former CEO of the Mighty Group, but she was the first Asian female of a FTSE 250 company. So if you haven't come across her before, check her out.
And if people want to find out more about you and what you're up to, where should they go to?
So my LinkedIn profile. So following successful private equity sale of my last place, I took a moment to pause and reset, and I'm ready to take on my next opportunity, which I'll be joining a SaaS tech high growth company in the next few weeks. So watch this space.
And if people want to be able to, people listening right now could help you, what can they do?
I'm always on the lookout for new talent, always looking to learn from other founders and entrepreneurs out there and build a network of people. And I'm also quite interested to learn about angel investment.
So great to have you on today. Have you got any final words?
Managing people is an art and a science.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.